This is a guide for connecting a second data source to your Graphweaver instance. In this example, we'll be picking up where the Connect to Postgres database tutorial ended. So we have a Graphweaver instance that's up and running and connected to a Postgres database, and we'll be extending that to connect to a MySQL database and connect entities across those two databases and expose them in one GraphQL API. So we're going to do that in 3 simple steps. We're going to create that new MySQL database. We're going to update our connections in Graphweaver, and then we're going to create the new data entity and schema entities representing that data. A couple things we need to have before we start. You need to have Node version 18 or greater. You need PNPN version 8 or greater. We'll also be using the MySQL shell client, and we are assuming that you already have a Graphweaver instance up and running with Postgres. So let's get started here. First, let's make sure you have a MySQL database up and running with a user named root, an empty password, and that's running on port 3306. And we'll go ahead and create a new database there. And then we're going to create an entity called to-dos. We're going to create a new table for that with a description, an isCompleted flag, and a user ID, which will be pointing to the users that exist in the Postgres database. And then let's populate that table. Cool, let's just double check, make sure that's all in there. There's our database. See these tables. Great, there we go. Next step here is to update the connections in Graphweaver. The first thing we need to do is install the micro-ORM MySQL package, because that'll allow us to talk to a SQL database. Let's just grab the version that I know we need here. And it's important to note that we need to match the package. We need to match the versions across the micro-ORM packages. So in this case, it's all 5.4.2. Whatever yours is, you need to make sure those match. And we will pnpm install. And once that's done, we will need to jump into our project, open up the database.ts file, and we need to include that new MySQL driver, and we're going to create a new connection now. So first, let's rename this connection. This is the existing Postgres connection. And we are going to create a new connection to the MySQL database. Just going to jump down here and grab this. And right now, our to-do is an entity that we haven't created yet, so it's going to be all red and squiggly here. We'll update that in a second. And we also need to restructure our folders right here, because right now entities are all coming from that Postgres database, and that's not what's going to happen anymore. We're going to have 2 different folders here, one for our MySQL entities, and one for our PostgreSQL entities. And these are our data entities. And the way that I think about this is that there's data entities and there are schema entities. And the data entities talk to your databases, your data sources, and the schema entities are what you're exposed in your GraphQL API. So I'm just going to copy the user and the index file here. I'm going to make sure it goes to the right place. I'm going to rename these. This is our to-do data entity. And let's hop into here. Our to-do data entity is going to look like this. It's going to have that description, isCompleted, and user ID. And we just need to make sure we're exporting this all correctly. So we're actually removing this, removing this. This is not a user, this is a to-do. We're not exporting this like this anymore. We're exporting both of those. And we're going to jump into the index file at the entities level. We're going to export star from MySQL. Thank you. And then let's jump back to our database and restructure this to import our to-do and our user. And now this config is an array of the entities. And because we're in the Postgres connection, we are providing the user as the entity from there. And our to-do is coming from our MySQL database. Next step here is to jump into the schema now that we're all connected and create a new to-do entity down there. And our to-do schema entity is going to look a lot like our user. So I'm going to copy and paste that user and rename this to to-do. And then these schema entities have the entity itself, which will look like this in the case of the to-do. And the important bit here is that our to-do has these simple fields, and then it has this relationship field which describes this relationship to the user by the key, which is user ID, and will return you the entire user once you request that. We also need to update our resolver here to include, to not be a user, but to be a to-do. And that connection is not a connection anymore. It is MySQL connection, because that is the data source for this entity. Let's jump over here, see what this is complaining about. This also needs to be updated to be Postgres. That's that Postgres connection. Let's make sure we're exporting everything correctly. So we're going to export everything from to-do. And now that resolvers doesn't exist, but we have our to-do resolver and our user resolver. And we're going to pass that array, there it was, just like that. And at this point, we should be able to restart our server. No matching export in source backend schema to do entity for import to do. Oh, I just didn't save. That would do it. Let's start the server again. Cool, looks like that has started successfully. Let's open up our localhost 9000. And with any luck, we'll be seeing, yes, our two data sources are Postgres and our new MySQL data source, which also represents the user. This is the user ID. Let's do one more thing. Let's set that up so that is a summary field, which will allow us to display the username instead of just this ID, because an ID is just a number. Let's tack on the @summary field. Don't know if that actually needs to be there. Save this, restart the server, and now we'll see that username instead of the ID. Yep, and now you can see that username, and we are reaching across from our MySQL into our Postgres database and displaying that all in one API. Let's do one more thing. Let's go over to the playground and request our to-dos and get information about the users that are attached to those to-dos. And there we go. We have our to-dos, which are assigned to our user 1, whose name is John. And that's how you connect two different data sources in Graphweaver.